I always wash my fabric in the washer and dry it in the dryer before I use it. I want all of the sizings and finishes washed out of the fabric, all the things that make it slick and stiff. I want that out. Slick fabric is actually harder to sew with. Now, you may not believe me if you never have washed your fabric, but give it a try. When you put two layers of fabric together and they are slick, they move apart. That's a problem in applique, it's a problem in piecing. And some of the additives that are put into fabric cause some people to have allergic reactions. I don't have that problem, but just knowing that the fabric outgasses, I just as soon not have that in my house. Plus, there's the things you don't think about. I've been contacted by quilters who work in the shipping industry, and they said, you know, those containers and the warehouses where fabric is made, they are not necessarily clean. And in fact, the words rat droppings came up. Are there rat droppings in this fabric? Probably not. But are they as clean as we assume that they might be? Well, that's probably not too. Again, I want all that stuff washed out of the fabric before I work with it. So I've got this lovely little bundle of fabrics. I will be opening them up and washing them before I use them. The other thing that will happen in the washer and in the dryer is that the fabric will shrink. And you may not be thinking how much fabric shrinks, but it can shrink a lot. Fabric shrinks more from side to side, from selvage to selvage, than it does on the length of the grain. So let's say you're buying layer cakes or the charm squares and you think these will be great because they're going to stay square. Once they're washed, they do not stay square. They become slightly more rectangular. And you might think, well, but they'll all shrink up the same way. Well, that's not true either. Every individual fabric is going to have a tendency to shrink at its own rates. And it's not just this tiny little bit. Now with small pieces, yeah, it'd be a tiny little bit. But if you're washing yardage, there can be 2-3 inches shrinkage across the width, sometimes more, and also shrinkage along the length. Some fabrics shrink more than others, so something coarse like a homespun or a flannel, well, they're going to shrink more than something like a batik. Batiks are already tightly woven and they've been through a washing process, so they're not going to shrink as much. So, personally, I want the fabric to have a little bit of a raised nap so it's not slick. I want it to be clean, and I want it to be shrunk to its final size before I cut it and begin to use it. So what I use to clean the fabric is either going to be retro wash, this is a powder, or Orvis paste. This is a paste. It doesn't take very much of either one. Of the Orvis paste, you might only need a teaspoon, maybe a little more, in a high efficiency machine per washer load. And retro wash, the information is on the package. Again, not very much. But then you have to think about dye migration because some colors are possibly going to run and others may not. Know that the water chemistry where you live has a big effect on how much or how little dye is going to migrate. If you wash your fabric, you make a quilt, you give it to someone who lives somewhere else, they probably need to understand what to do to be sure that the first time they wash a quilt, it's not going to bleed and be a problem. So there are chemicals for that. There's Retain. Retain stops the bleed, and the directions for use are on the bottle. It keeps the dye in the fabric. It doesn't set the dye, but it keeps the dye in the fabric. If you wash your fabric with Retain and then wash it again without Retain, be aware that you could have bleeding problems. These days I mostly use Retain when I am washing a quilt, but not when I'm washing yardage that comes in. Then there's Synthropol. What Synthropol does is keep any dye that comes out of the fabric from redepositing into the fabric. So I do use Synthropol when I wash brand new yardage, and I also add a color catcher or two, or if it's a big load of dark fabric, I might add 3 of these in the wash because these two products together grab the dye out of the water and hold on to it. Know that when you use color catchers, if you pull them out of the washer and the color catcher has color in it, there's not a guarantee that you got all of the dye out of the fabric. Depending on what it is and how dark my color catcher is, I sometimes re-wash and put in more color catchers just to check it. Some of these products tell you to use hot water. I just use hot water. If that's what the product says, I tend to believe the manufacturer. Pieces of fabric that are fat quarter size and bigger, I just throw in the washer. And I don't do anything fancy to the edges. And yes, indeed, there are threads that come out and they tie up together. And when I'm pulling them out of the washer, I smooth out the fabrics, I cut off the threads, and I throw them in the dryer. Because I also want to dry these in the dryer, because I think even more shrinkage happens there. Remember, I want the grain to raise, and I want the fabric to go ahead and shrink now before I use it. So I throw it in the dryer, and I try not to over dry it. I don't want it to be rock hard when I pull it out of the dryer. I do my best to pull it out when it's still warm. So what I do is pull fabric out of the dryer, and I smooth it down on the washer about like this, and I go ahead and pull all the fabric out and get it about like this in a stack, and then I'll go ahead and fold it like this to go into my closet where all the fabric lives. I do not iron at this time unless I've washed one of those fabrics that comes out of the dryer and it's a knot. Often those are woven fabrics. Well, those I'll go ahead and iron before I put them in the closet. I do not use any spray products on the fabric. I don't find that I need to use starch or best press or any of those other things that people keep talking about. Once I've washed the fabric to make it clean, I really don't want to add anything else to it other than water. I spray with water, and I sometimes use steam in my iron, but that's about it. So what if you have a closet full of fabric that hasn't been washed yet? What I recommend you do is take a sample and wash it, and use that washed fabric and see what you think. And if after doing that you agree with me that working with washed fabric is both more pleasant and easier, well then you might want to wash your stash. And while you wash your stash, use that as an opportunity to go through your fabric, sort it by color, maybe by value, maybe weed out the things you really know you no longer love, and then you'll end up with a stash that is organized, full of fabric that you love and that you're willing to use. I hope you find this information to be helpful, and now we can move on to the rest of the class.